Final Fantasy XI turns 19 years old this month. The game's golden era has long since passed, and yet the MMO's player base has seen a boost in numbers in recent years, especially during the pandemic. There's even new story content being added to the game, bolstering the already enormous amount of content available in Final Fantasy XI. On the other hand, the dev team is open that Square Enix only has plans on supporting the game through its 20th anniversary, and that further support depends on the players. That could give potential new players pause, especially after the news that the Final Fantasy XI remake for mobile was officially cancelled. That all raises the question, is Final Fantasy XI worth playing in 2021 if you're completely new to the game? I decided to find out for myself and share my experiences for anyone else out there curious about this classic MMO. First, I just want to say that this is not a guide for new players, nor is it reflections from an expert long-term veteran. This is more of a reflection on my time with the game so far, and I want to share my experiences from the perspective of a relative newbie, and hopefully help people out there decide if they want to give Final Fantasy XI a shot, even if they've never played this game before. Now, I'm actually not a total newbie. I did play the game for a few months back in 2007 to 2008, right around the Treasures of At-Urgen and Wings of the Goddess era. Final Fantasy XI was my first true MMO at the time. I had experience with multiplayer games like Diablo 1 and 2, Phantasy Star Online, Monster Hunter, Crystal Chronicles. Guild Wars might have been the closest thing that I played, but that was an instance-based MMO kind of thing, whereas Final Fantasy XI was this totally new beast to me. So on that first time around, I got to level 13 as a Galka warrior. I had no idea what to do, and I quit. Then I tried playing again a couple years later in 2009, 2010. I had a Hume monk/thief, got to level 33 or so. I leveled warrior a little bit too. I had my sub-job unlocked. But when it came to getting past level 30 and going to the next phase of the leveling process, I found out I had to get all these airship keys to get to the new town. And that was the second time I quit Final Fantasy XI. And then I randomly got this wild hair to start playing again a little over a year ago. So I got the game on Steam, and I played a bit through that first free month, but just never fully had the time to commit to really playing the game until a few weeks ago. And now I'm at places in the game that I've never gotten to before. So I'm not a total newbie, but I'm also not an expert. I've never seen the level cap, and the game, as it is now, is very different from when I tried to play it back in the day. So I'll tell you kind of where I am in the game right now. For anyone who's curious, I'm a level 50 Dark Knight. I did some things out of order, but I'm working on my limit break quest. For anyone who doesn't know, when you hit level 50, you have to complete quests to get the next 5 levels. So you hit level 50, and then you have to do a quest so you can get to level 55. Then at 55, you do the same thing. And you do that all the way up to level 99. And this is the first real challenge that I faced in the game, but it's also where it's really starting to open up and show its depth and the potential for the sort of experiences that are really still possible in this game, despite the fact that it's a very different experience with a smaller player base. I've also leveled up Warrior, Samurai, and I went way out of my way to unlock Rune Fencer, for anyone who knows what that means. I've done some story quests, got my sub-job, unlocked mounts. I've reached rank 4 in the Sandoria Nation missions. Anyway, that's just for anyone who's played this game to understand where I am. That's probably less than halfway through the leveling process to the level cap. Just to give you an idea, if you've never played, that's about where I am, about halfway to the level cap. So how has that been so far, right? So far there's been good, and there's definitely been some obstacles. We'll start with the good. The world of Vana'diel is really cool. It's unique. It's very dangerous. This is an MMO with a very dangerous world, but that offers you a sense of adventure and exploration that I don't think I've ever had in another MMO. There's a quote from Heather Alexandria, formerly of Kotaku. When she tried out Final Fantasy XI a few years ago for the first time, she compared it to Final Fantasy XIV, saying that Final Fantasy XIV's zones are like, a theme park, whereas Final Fantasy XI is like a national park. And I would definitely agree that that is what this game feels like. It feels like you're exploring this massive, vast, dangerous world. And the world and the atmosphere was the one thing from the game that I remember the most fondly, and the thing that I most wanted to experience more of. And I'm very happy to say that it's very easy now to travel, see these zones, experience, the different zones, the different dungeons, just bask in the atmosphere, and it's all excellent so far. The job system is also really neat. Some of the jobs are really interesting, even in the limited capacity that I played so far, and I'm really excited to see how some of them open up as you level up beyond, this level 50 cap, and eventually, hopefully, get to the end game and see what that's all about. There's new stuff like, the trust system, which is awesome for helping you level super fast, makes exploration safer, and helps you unlock content and try new jobs out a lot easier. In the past, you had to always be in a party in this game, and that made trying things really difficult. And if you didn't have friends to help you out, you would get stuck, you'd get lost, you'd probably get burnt out, but a lot of that isn't there anymore. It feels like you can experiment a lot more, and you're even encouraged to, I would say. Some of the annoying stuff that I recall about the game has either been simplified or removed. The airship keys that I mentioned that I quit over, they don't even exist anymore. You can get to these zones way easier. You can teleport and travel to places as you need to. Honestly, all these changes made it so that it just took me a few days of casual play to reach goals that I have in Final Fantasy XI from way back when that would have taken me months or longer to get to when I tried to play back in the day. The requirement for the constant aid of other players, it fostered a great community, but it made it difficult to progress on your own or casually. And now you can solo stuff, which is good because, the world isn't as populated and you can just play it on your own time. That said, Final Fantasy XI is actually fairly active still. The in-game hubs have lots of players, at least on the Ashura server, which is where I play. I see other people in the world all the time. Link shells are active, the chat is active. Outside of the game, the subreddit, the wiki, the forums are all active. It seems like there's even, tons of new people recently making content about Final Fantasy XI in the past couple of years. To be fair, most of the players and most of the content and chatter is about the endgame stuff, but there's still tons of newer and lower level people out there playing too. And that was the one thing I was concerned about, was that the game would feel lonely, empty, and that soloing would be impossible. But between trusts and new teleportation systems and just faster movement speed in general, it's a lot easier. It's not a cakewalk, and there's still plenty of opportunity to group up. In fact, the other day I was in a dungeon and I saw another player hanging out there, and we were both, looking for a couple quest items, and we partied up, and we met up with another guy, and then filled out our party with trust, and you get kind of the sense of that camaraderie and cooperation that Final Fantasy XI is so beloved for. So that's all stuff that I've really enjoyed about this game. And, as someone who enjoys maybe some old school game design and harder, challenging gameplay, I've really clicked with a lot of that stuff. But there are some obstacles that I've run into as well. The game, it does look older. This is a PS2 game originally, so it sometimes looks that way. That said, there are mods and other add-ons that you can get that will help with that. And some of the later stuff, like as you get outside of the original entry-level content, there's a definite uptick in quality compared to some of the earlier stuff. Speaking of which, the gameplay is definitely old school. Like, this is old school MMO game design, and that may turn some people off. There's a lot of cumbersome menu commands. There's a reliance on creating your own macro commands so you can properly time attacks, swap gear in the end game, which is something I barely know anything about, but I know it's a thing you have to do. You have to buy maps for new zones before you can see what is out there. Getting guild can be kind of annoying. There are some workarounds, and there's new ways to get money early on, and new currencies that you just kind of passively always earning that you can use on gear and stuff, which is really helpful. But there's still some brutally hard content. Even if most of it's soloable, it's still difficult. And when you die in Final Fantasy XI, you lose XP and you can level down. That's rare these days, especially where I am at in the game, but it's brutal when it happens. You can lose access to gear, and you won't be able to use abilities you've unlocked. It can really set you back a lot. Personally, I like some of this stuff, but it won't be for everyone. A good example is that dungeons in this game, Final Fantasy XI, are not instanced. They are public zones, just like most other places. There are some instance like boss areas and whatnot here and there, but for the most part, they're just public zones, which compared to other MMOs, these are just mazes filled with aggressive mobs and traps. It's nothing like, the theme park rides of Final Fantasy XIV and other MMOs. It reminds me a lot of like old school RPGs and like dungeon crawlers and stuff. which if you've watched my other videos, you know I'm a huge fan of. This game requires a lot of prep work. It requires, if you're partying, a lot of communication, and you may find yourself competing with other players to grab a unique monster or item that you need for a quest. That's an old school design. I find it really interesting and cool, and I enjoy it most of the time, but other people probably will find that a little bit annoying and maybe feel like the game just isn't respecting your time. Combat is also admittedly kind of boring for the first chunk of the game. It relies on weapon abilities and skill chains and combos with other party members or your AI trust members, and you don't have a lot of that at the beginning. You level up really fast, thankfully, now, and it gets better really fast because of that, but honestly, like, the combat didn't fully click with me until just a few nights ago when I played with those other players, and I got a little bit more of that as I continued to level up, and the AI trusts get better and smarter, and they can do more things as they level up with you, but each trust has its own behaviors, and sometimes they won't work perfectly, and there is some idiosyncrasies with the combat that won't fully click for everyone, especially if you're used to like the super fast-paced, very flashy combat of Final Fantasy XIV. And just in general, stuff takes a long time to do in Final Fantasy XI. I know it's way faster, but if you compare it to a lot of modern MMOs and just modern games in general, it takes some time. Veterans are going to say, can't believe you guys can get to level 99 in a few weeks or a couple months, whereas it took them years sometimes to get there. But in my opinion, other than the faster leveling than what I remember, and the slightly faster movement speeds, and the access to some teleportation options that we didn't have back when I tried to play the game, it doesn't always respect your time. And that's my biggest complaint so far. You still have to wait for stuff like specific in-world events to occur, specific items to drop. You have to do a lot of old school feeling grinding and farming, or just waiting around for things to happen. That, I don't know, it just feels a lot slower compared to other games, both MMOs and single player games alike. The other thing to note is that there is a subscription fee for this game, which will definitely put some people off. It's not that much, it's about $12 a month for a single character, and then a couple more dollars a month for every character you add on to that, and there's some other like expanded storage options and whatnot, but I'm just sticking with the base $12 a month subscription fee. And while, yeah, it kind of is weird to pay that much money for a almost 20-year-old MMORPG, it also means that the community that is in the game really wants to be there, they really want to be playing the game, and they want the experience to be good for everyone else. But I think right now is a good moment to take some time and preemptively answer a question I'm sure many folks are asking themselves, and that's why to play Final Fantasy XI when Final Fantasy XIV exists. I've made some comparisons so far. They see Final Fantasy XI with its older graphics and gameplay and immediately assume probably that Final Fantasy XIV is just a better, more modern game, especially because so many parts of Final Fantasy XIV are inspired or directly pulled from Final Fantasy XI. And in a sense, some of that is true, but it's not necessarily a question of better or worse in my eyes. They are very different games, despite both being MMORPGs set in the Final Fantasy series, so they share a lot of themes and songs and whatnot. Same job system, similar races between the games. There's even some crossover stuff where Final Fantasy XI storyline kind of crosses over into Final Fantasy XIV a bit. Final Fantasy XIV is a flashy game, big story set pieces, faster combat, and it's got tons of just this incredible Final Fantasy fan service. By contrast, Final Fantasy XI feels more like a Final Fantasy simulator rather than a theme park style MMO like Final Fantasy XIV. It gives you the opportunity to really embody the role of an iconic Final Fantasy job, team up with other players, party up with them, experience all of the adventurous highs and the tedious lows that would come with being a Final Fantasy character, like a simulation of that, not just an abstraction like we get in the main games, but like an actual going through those steps to be an adventurer. Final Fantasy XIV, on the other hand, it wants to give you this all-encompassing Final Fantasy themed roller coaster ride, and that is awesome, but it's just different from what Final Fantasy XI is trying to do. Even in this later era, filled with all this quality of life changes and faster progression, it's just, they're completely different games. Yes, Final Fantasy XI is older and it does show some of its age, but I don't think you can say that it is objectively worse in every single way. It really comes down to what you want out of your games. And so, yeah, it comes down to preference for which kind of game you want to play at a given moment. And I think both are worth trying, especially if you like MMORPGs in general, or you like Final Fantasy in general. I think both are worth trying out. But, that said, I will say that there is one thing that I think Final Fantasy XI has going for it that Final Fantasy XIV doesn't, and that's the pressure to play. I played Final Fantasy XIV a bit, but I've played it very casually, and I always kind of feel like I'm behind the pack in that game. I've never fully clicked with it, to be honest, which is kind of part of the issue, and part of why I tried out Final Fantasy XI, but I just don't feel like playing Final Fantasy XIV every day, and I know you don't really have to, and I know that part of that feeling is probably self-inflicted. Plenty of people play Final Fantasy XIV along with other games, but it's just something I notice about Final Fantasy XIV and its pacing is I feel like I have to commit to it in a way, and I like to play a variety of games at my own pace. So that's why, Final Fantasy XIV for me, that's I guess the biggest barrier of entry for me to really get into that game. And I've played a lot of it, but I still don't feel like I've really fully clicked with it. Ironically, though, I don't feel that way with Final Fantasy XI, at least not yet. Maybe when I get to the end game, maybe that will change, and I'm really playing with lots of other players. But Final Fantasy XI held the reputation of being a giant life-eating time sink that you had to fully commit to. And yeah, the game has 12 expansions and add-ons to play through, there's tons of content. But because Final Fantasy XI isn't as active anymore, and we probably won't be getting any more content additions other than these small storyline things that have showed up here and there. But that's only a few quests, and I'm nowhere near seeing it. And, who knows, maybe Square Enix will drop a surprise expansion on us one day. But anyway, because Final Fantasy is not as active anymore, I don't feel the rush to complete it all ASAP to get ready for new content, like I do when I play Final Fantasy XIV. I've really been able to play Final Fantasy XI casually, on my own time, set my own goals, and enjoy the journey. And I think, if you play it, that's how you should play it, because that's how I've done it so far, and I've really enjoyed it. Now, if you ask an old school veteran, if you ask them, is the game worth playing today? Chances are they'll probably say yes, right? But they will tell you that the game's golden era, like I said at the beginning, the game's golden era is over. And the veteran players, many of them lament the changes that Square Enix has introduced since the last expansion in 2015. And most of these players are focused on collecting as much rare endgame gear as they can. Maybe they're leveling up a new character here and there, but for me, I'm playing Final Fantasy XI to have that leveling experience, to finally experience the stuff that I always wanted to back in the day, but just never had the time to, or just never was able to because I didn't understand the game. The stuff like the unique job system, the world, and just experience the charm that the game still has somehow, even though it's technically a PlayStation 2 game that originally released back in 2002. So yeah, I finally feel like I'm getting the experience I wanted with the game in a much more accessible way that I can play casually. So, bottom line, I definitely plan to keep playing Final Fantasy XI. This is probably the only major Final Fantasy XI related video I'll be making for now. I don't know, maybe if I make it to level 99 and beyond, I'll maybe make another video to update you on how that all goes too. But, I have other games I want to talk about, plus I'm working on a game that I'm still making and I need to update you all on. But I guess, bottom line, if you feel like trying out Final Fantasy XI and you think that the experiences that I've given so far sound interesting to you, you like the way the game sounds, you feel like you can gel with the game in the same way, I definitely recommend going for it. There's a lot of caveats, but it's worth trying it out if you're even the least bit curious. And don't feel bad if you don't like it. It's a weird game. It's not going to be for everyone, but I really like it. Anyway, I hope that gives you all a sense of what the Final Fantasy XI experience is like for a new player in 2021. If you've made it this far and you feel like giving Final Fantasy XI a shot as well, I have a few quick tips to share. First, I highly recommend you check out Basic Guardian's YouTube channel, specifically his Final Fantasy XI New Game Plus series that he recently started. It's super entertaining, it's really funny, and it just gives a good indication of what the early game experience is like in real time. His recent video on, playing Final Fantasy XI casually was really what inspired me to make this video, so shouts out to him. Go give him a subscribe and like. Great content. Highly recommend it. I also recommend checking out another channel, 2 channels actually. The first is Hunt for Games, which is an excellent Final Fantasy XI focused channel, and the other is the Final Fantasy XI Beginner Guides from Ginger Prime. I'll link all of those down below, but they have been really helpful for me. I will also be linking some helpful guides from the BG Wiki and the Final Fantasy XI subreddit that I think all new players should have bookmarked. And finally, if you're on the Ashura server and you want to hit me up, please feel free. I'd love to play with more folks. But anyways, guys, that is going to do it for me. Thanks, as always, for watching, and I'll catch you in the next upload.